Hello makers, and welcome to Share Stitchery. I'm Catherine Harris, and I do sewing and DIY videos and tips and tricks that I release each week. So if you want to learn more, don't forget to hit that subscribe button down below. This week, I thought I'd do something a little different. I was scrolling the internet looking for new indie patterns, and I came across a website called Lekala Patterns. And what it does is it allows you to take a number of specific measurements, and then it'll spit out a pattern that is tailored specifically to you and your measurements. And I thought that it would be pretty neat. So I thought I would tell you about my experience with this pattern company and how everything went. One of the first things to note is it doesn't come with seam allowances. And even though it had a button to try and select the seam allowances, I couldn't select it. It just wouldn't let me. The next thing was when I printed out the PDF patterns, there was no page numbers on it and no way for me to match it up. So I had to seriously match it up like a little puzzle and try to get all the pieces together, and it took way longer than any other PDF pattern that I've put together. That being said, the fit on this is absolutely superb. It fit me perfectly and I didn't have to make any adjustments. Now, one thing on this specific pattern is when it spit out the pattern, it was incredibly short, like just under my buttocks short. So I decided to add an additional seam allowance and hem along the bottom and add some extra length to that. On the downside, I had already cut out all the pieces. I was excited to get started, so I'd laid everything out and I'd cut it all out. And then I started to look at the pieces and I held it up against myself and realized it is incredibly short. So make sure you take a look at that ahead of time before you cut things out. So that is the reason why I have a little white stripe along the bottom hem of my skirt. That's actually the join mark between where I joined those two seams and added a little extra length in there. So let's get to it. The Lekala 4552 Mod 1960s dress. So let's start with the back zipper. So first you're going to take both back pieces and then you are going to finish the edges. I'm deciding to do mine with the serger because it's nice and quick. And once those are in place, we are now going to install our invisible zip. So I've marked my invisible zipper here. And then what I'm going to do is I am going to measure how far down my seam allowance is going to be, and I added on my own seam allowances. So just make sure you remember what your seam allowance is on the collar that you put, and just put the stop right at the seam allowance. And then we're just going to pin that in place and stitch that with an invisible zipper foot. And then we're going to do the same for the other side. If you want a more thorough tutorial on installing an invisible zipper, I'll leave a link in the card up above and in the description down below. So we're going to take that over to our sewing machine and we are just going to stitch that in place. And then we are going to flip it up. So as I pull the zipper up here, you can see how seamless of a transition it is. So next, we need to finish the back seam here. So we're going to put right sides together, and because I have that extra piece of fabric here because I needed to lengthen my skirt, I'm going to match that up. Then we're going to pin along here. Now we're going to start about 5 centimeters from the bottom and stitch down and then go back and stitch up. So I backstitch both at the top and the bottom on both of these because it is an area of tension here. So following my seam allowance, I'm just going to finish the bottom end. Now what we're going to do is we are going to switch to our zipper foot. So just a traditional zipper foot. so that we can get nice and close to the edge of that invisible zipper. So I'm just flipping it over and I'm putting my needle down exactly where I left off, and I'm back stitching here as well. And then I am going up as close as I can to where that seam is, making sure that the tail of the zipper is pushed off to the side. And I'm doing a nice good back stitch here for security reasons. And then you can see just how close we've got the stitching here. So we're going to press the seams open, and then my additional seams I'm just pressing down. Next, onto the back princess seams. So you're going to take the back of your dress and you're going to match up the side back pieces, making sure that you've marked all of the notches that were on the pattern pieces. And that's what we're going to pin first. So you're going to start at the shoulder seam and then you're going to match up all of the notches. There's usually a notch at the apex of the bust or the shoulder, the waist, and the hip. So we're just going to pin all of that in place, and then we're going to stitch down along the side seams here, and we're going to do that for both sections. Because this is a knit, I am changing mine to my lightning stitch or a narrow zigzag stitch, and I'm just stitching down with my sewing machine, and then I am going to go in with my serger to finish those seams so they are nice and beautiful. Then I'm going to press my seams towards the back zipper, making sure that I'm also pressing down those seams on my additional piece. Next are the front princess seams. So we're going to take our front bodice piece as well as our front side pieces, and we're going to match them up just the same as we matched up the back princess seams. So right sides together and matching up the apex of the bust right here along both of the notches, and then I'll go up to the shoulder seams and make sure to put pins in between there. And just making sure that everything is lying perfectly, and everything should line up quite nicely, and you shouldn't have to stretch the fabric at all. It should all just line up. And once you've got all those pins in, make sure you do the same to the other side, and then we're going to stitch from the bottom all the way through to the top to attach them together. And then I've also serged the edges, and then I'm going to press them so that they point inwards towards the center of your dress. Now onto the Peter Pan collar. So you're going to have 4 pieces, a right and a left side with an upper and a lower, and you're going to place fusible interfacing along the uppers. And if you notice, I don't have any interfacing along the seam allowances. That's to alleviate any bulk that's in there. Now we're going to stitch around the sides and the outer edge, leaving the inner edge of the collar open. And so as you stitch in here, next, you are going to want to trim those seam allowances a little bit. So I'm taking out my pinking shears to give a nice even edge along there and a nice transition. So when you have the zigzagged edges, it transitions a little bit nicer underneath the garments. Next, I'm clipping the corners as well as adding in a couple of notches along the rounded pieces of the collar to enable the turn of the cloth to really flow nicely and give no puckers. So I'm just going to turn that right side out, making sure to push out the corners and all the edges, and then I'm going to give it a nice good press. So I wanted to show you here what the dress looks like on the dress form. So you can see that the princess lines are lining up exactly to the lines that I have on my custom dress form that I have made to myself. So this pattern is impeccable in terms of fit, and I'm excited to try a couple of the other patterns as well. It lines up exactly. Now onto the side seams and our shoulder seams. So we are just going to line up those shoulder seams and the side seams and pin and stitch them. And then it's going to start to look a little bit more like a wearable dress. And so I've also serged the edges just the same as I did on all the other seams that we have. Next is attaching the collar. So we're going to take the one side of the collar, and there is a front and a back, so just make sure you've got that in place. And then on the side with the interfacing, we're going to place that right sides to our dress. And so you've got little notches on there. One of the notches is for the shoulder seam, and then the front of the collar is going to match up to your center seam notch on the bodice of the dress. And then the back of the collar is going to match up exactly in the center where the zipper goes. So once you've pinned in those pieces, you can fill in the pins in between there and making sure you're only stitching on one layer of fabric. So you only want to stitch on that layer with the interfacing. So don't catch both of them in there. So you just want to get one. And then you're going to stitch each individual collar. So you're going to start at the back and work towards the center. So I'm just rolling that seam back so that I have the seam exactly where the zipper butts up when we zip it up. So you've got that perfect fit. And don't forget to backstitch at the front and the end. And I'm just following in on that seam allowance, which I determined the edge of my presser foot there. And you're just going to the center seam here. Do not go over that center seam, backstitch, and then you're going to do the other collar in the exact same manner. And now that you've got the collar pieces attached on, it'll look just like this. You want to keep it to the wrong side here. You can flip it over to the right side if you like, but you're going to be working with the wrong side of the fabric. So what you're going to do here is you are going to fold over the edge of the collar the same amount as your seam allowance, and you're going to match that up exactly with that stitching line. So you're just going to get that pinned in place and do that all the way around the collar. So it should look something like this. I also gave it a nice good press. Then you're going to take out your hand stitching and you're going to stitch a ladder stitch in here, and you're going to catch the back end of the seam allowances so that no stitching shows along the front and it's completely hidden. You could do this by machine, but you will see those stitches, and I don't think it looks nearly as professional. So this is what the collar should look like. Now you've got it perfectly lined up in the front and the back. And next we are going to set in our sleeves. So you've got a two-piece sleeve in this pattern, which I actually enjoy much more than a one-piece sleeve. So you've got the under piece, which I've got on the top here that goes under your armpit, and then you've got the larger piece that rolls over your shoulder. I find these two-piece sleeves very flattering. You don't have to do any gathering in the shoulders to set them in, and they fit the arm much nicer, and I think they look a little bit more chic than some of the other sleeves. So I'm just pinning both sides, right sides together, making sure to match up those notches. And then you're going to stitch both seams and serge them. I also serged the bottom edge where I'm going to do the hem here. So next I'm doing the hem, and I've just rolled it over once the length of the serging stitches and then once a couple of inches up, and this will give me a 3/4 length sleeve. I did measure that on myself before I did any of the stitching, and I stitched it the same as the collar. Now we're going to actually set those sleeves in. So you're going to do right side to right side, and you're going to keep your sleeve right side out, and then working from the wrong side or the inside of your garment, you are going to pin those together. This makes it a little easier to stitch when you're working on this end, and it avoids any certain puckering that might occur when you actually take it to the machine to get that stitched. So you're going to put in a decent amount of pins. I like to put them in up and down as opposed to side to side. Now onto the bottom hem. So this I hemmed exactly the same as I did the sleeves, and I've just rolled it over, and then I am hand stitching it in place so that you've got that nice invisible seam and no stitches. You could stitch this with machine, it would look perfectly fine. I'm just showing you here the detail that I put in with some ribbon along that seam. Thought it gives it a little extra character. This was such a quick and easy make. And another thing that I really like is because it's made out of a scuba knit, it is so comfortable. And other than the few little hiccups that I had mentioned earlier with the length being incredibly short and the fact that you had to puzzle piece the PDF pattern pieces together, this is a fantastic pattern. And I love that I didn't have to make any adjustments. One thing that I might consider doing is removing the sleeves and the collar and making a cute little shift dress for the summertime. So if you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up. And if you decide to try out Lekala patterns, I'd love to see how your experience went. So don't forget to tag me on Instagram at Stitchery. Until next time, makers, let's get our Sew-Spiration on.